Rick Ross just pulled off the most spectacular self-demolition in modern hip-hop history. Not 50 Cent. Not Drake. Rick Ross did this to Rick Ross. Every single move Rick Ross made over the last 18 months, every interview, every diss, every headline-chasing comment, funneled directly toward one outcome, an album projected to sell 17,000 copies in its first week. 17,000. For a man who spent 2 decades calling Rick Ross the biggest boss. For a man who compared Rick Ross's catalog to Drake's. For a man who sat on podcasts wearing $1 million ring, bragging about penthouse views and $500 million mindsets. 17,000 copies. And the worst part? Every single step that led here was visible from miles away. Nobody wanted to say it. Today, we connect every dot. And by the end of this breakdown, the picture will be so clear that ignoring it would require deliberate blindness. What we are about to lay out is not opinion. This is a forensic reconstruction, move by move, decision by decision, of how Rick Ross systematically dismantled the very infrastructure that kept Rick Ross commercially relevant for 20 years. We pulled the streaming numbers. We tracked the timeline. We cross-referenced the interviews, the Instagram posts, the podcast appearances, the tour seating charts. And what emerges is a pattern so deliberate, so consistent, that calling it an accident feels generous. Rick Ross built an empire on collaboration, on proximity to bigger stars, on the sheen of musical luxury. Then Rick Ross burned every bridge that fed that machine, and watched the numbers crater in real time. Let us start where the cracking began, the Drake relationship. For years, Rick Ross and Drake formed one of the most commercially lethal partnerships in rap. Aston Martin Music. Stay scheming, Lord knows. Track after track where Drake's melodic instincts elevated Rick Ross's booming, cinematic production into crossover territory. Drake was not just a collaborator. Drake was the hit engine, the bridge between Rick Ross's core audience and the streaming masses who consume music through algorithmic playlists and viral moments. Remove Drake from the equation, and the equation changes fundamentally. Then Rick Ross walked away from that bridge and poured gasoline on the remains. The timeline matters here. Rick Ross started publicly distancing from Drake right as Kendrick Lamar's campaign against Drake reached its peak. Rick Ross joined the pile-on, calling Drake BBL Drizzy, dismissing Drake's catalog, mocking Drake's album Iceman as horrendous. On the Joe Budden podcast, when pressed about what actually caused the fallout, Rick Ross offered a curious answer, wishing Drake success while simultaneously continuing to drop Drake's name in every interview that followed. Fans immediately noticed the contradiction. You do not publicly wish someone well while weaponizing that person's name for headlines at every turn. That is not peace. That is performance. Here is what the streaming data reveals about the cost of that severed bridge. On Set in Stone, only 2 tracks crossed the 1 million stream mark. The collaboration with T.I. sits around 1.8 million. The French Montana and Max B track hovers near 4.4 million. For context, a single Drake collaboration in peak years could generate tens of millions of streams in its opening week alone. Rick Ross did not just lose a friend. Rick Ross lost a gravitational pull that dragged casual listeners into Rick Ross's orbit. Without Drake, the audience that might have streamed the album out of habit or association simply never showed up. The bridge was not just musical. The bridge was commercial. The bridge was algorithmic. Rick Ross burned it on purpose. And here is the detail nobody is highlighting enough. Rick Ross admitted on camera that Drake brought the alley-oop. Rick Ross said those exact words. An alley-oop, by definition, means one person sets up the score and another finishes. Rick Ross was telling the world, in plain language, that Drake was the setup man, the playmaker, the one who created the commercial opening. Yet Rick Ross chose to trash the very teammate who kept Rick Ross on the scoreboard. That is not strategy. That is self-sabotage wearing a tailored suit. Now, layer on the second self-inflicted wound, the 50 Cent obsession. This beef has been simmering since January 2009, when Mafia music leaked and Rick Ross took the first shot at 50 Cent on wax. Nearly 2 decades. Most rivalries burn out after a few years. This one refuses to die because neither party will let it. But here's where the math turns brutal for Rick Ross. 50 Cent operates on a completely different battlefield. 50 Cent is not trying to sell music right now. 50 Cent has television empires, liquor deals, film studio investments in Shreveport. 50 Cent's income does not depend on first-week album numbers. So when Rick Ross throws shots, mentioning 50 Cent's baby mother Daphne Joy on a podcast, mocking 50 Cent's wardrobe, questioning 50 Cent's finances, offering 50 Cent a business sit-down on camera, 50 Cent absorbs the hits and fires back from a position of zero musical vulnerability. The result? Every time Rick Ross provokes 50 Cent, 50 Cent responds with surgical precision, and 50 Cent's responses travel further than Rick Ross's originals. When Set in Stone projections leaked, under 26,000 units, potentially debuting outside the Billboard Top 20, 50 Cent did not wait. 50 Cent posted on Instagram, "I just saw your record sales. LOL. 2,000? What the expletive?" Then 50 Cent piled on, 20 features and it didn't help. Then the killing blow. The boat sank. Album went wood. Nobody checking for that. Then 50 Cent twisted the knife with a car show and chicken wings line, telling Rick Ross to promote car shows and sell wings because tickets and albums were not selling. Each post was a precision strike, timed for maximum humiliation. And the tour data backed 50 Cent up. Seating charts for a Miami venue showed oceans of unsold green dots, empty seats dominating the map. Rick Ross's team responded with buy one get 50% off discounts. Desperation pricing. The kind of move that signals to the market that demand has collapsed. And 50 Cent screenshot every bit of it and broadcast the collapse to millions. The venue map became a visual indictment. The discount became a confession. The boss was begging for buyers. Here is a trap Rick Ross keeps walking into. 50 Cent has nothing to lose musically. Rick Ross has everything to lose musically. Every exchange is asymmetrical. 50 Cent fires from the safety of a non-music revenue fortress. Rick Ross fires from a sinking ship that 50 Cent is happily pointing cameras at. Rick Ross even offered 50 Cent a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to present studio ideas at a table, a move that read less like a genuine business invitation and more like a desperate bid to redirect the narrative. 50 Cent swatted it away. The power imbalance is not close. One man is selling albums. The other man is selling television shows. Guess which one has leverage when the topic is album sales? Then came Canada. And this is where the connect-the-dots pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Rick Ross traveled to Canada around the time of a Drake-related event. Footage from attendees showed a tense confrontation breaking out. Clips spread across every platform within hours. Critics pounced immediately. The optics were catastrophic. A rapper who built an entire image on invincible boss energy getting confronted and leaving the area on camera. Whether the details matched the narrative or not did not matter. The footage spoke louder than any clarification ever could. Within 48 hours, the clip was remixed, captioned, and recontextualized across every platform. The internet does not wait for context. The internet runs with the image. 50 Cent, predictably, did not let the moment breathe. Fans expected 50 Cent to jump in, and 50 Cent delivered. The Canada incident became another data point in a mounting pattern. Rick Ross picking fights on multiple fronts and absorbing losses on each one. Drake's camp, 50 Cent's camp, Canadian crowds, the jewelry authentication controversy, the commercial flight photos. Each incident feeding the next, each headline compounding the damage, each meme hardening the public narrative that the boss era was ending. Speaking of a commercial flight, Drake dropped a line on Iceman. "If I'm lying, I'm flying economy," and the internet immediately connected those lyrics to Rick Ross. Photos circulated showing Rick Ross on a commercial flight. Memes exploded. Rick Ross is going broke trended across platforms. Rick Ross explained that a private jet was being upgraded with Starlink and that flying commercial was a choice to go party with Trick Daddy. The explanation landed like a thud on concrete. Nobody bought it. The damage was done, and the joke wrote itself. The man who claims half-billion-dollar mindsets is flying economy, while the man Rick Ross called Wash is dropping subliminal diss tracks from first class. The contrast was devastating and entirely self-created. Then the luxury watch commentator entered the conversation, questioning the authenticity of certain jewelry pieces Rick Ross had showcased online. The claim spread. Rick Ross denied. But in the court of public opinion, denial without receipts is just noise. Each controversy stacked on the previous one, creating compounding narrative. The boss image is cracking. The diamonds might be fake. The jet might be gone. The seats might be empty. The album might be wood. Piece by piece, the mythology was being dismantled, and Rick Ross kept handing out the tools. Now, let us perform the actual autopsy on Set in Stone itself. 20 features. Rick Ross loaded this album with guest appearances. Rich the Kid, YFN Lucci, Don Toliver, Big X Plug, The Dream, Gucci Mane, Kodak Black, Young Miami, T.I., French Montana, Max B. A roster that, on paper, should generate massive excitement. But examine the streaming behavior and a different story surfaces. The features did not move the needle. The audience did not show up for the names. And when listeners did engage, the feedback was blunt. On the YFN Lucci collaboration, listeners noted that YFN Lucci carried the energy while Rick Ross failed to leave a dominant impression on what was supposedly Rick Ross's own record. That inversion matters because it reveals a deeper structural issue. When your own album makes listeners prefer the guest verses over your own, the feature strategy has backfired. The features were supposed to elevate the project. Instead, the features exposed the gap between the collaborator's energy and the host's contribution. The host became the guest. The boss became the background. 20 features. Under 10,000 in pure album sales. The math is merciless. Rick Ross spent energy assembling a constellation of collaborators but could not generate a single moment that caught fire. No viral snippet. No TikTok-ready bar. No Drake-sized streaming injection. The album entered the world, and the world shrugged. For a man who titled the project Set in Stone, meant to represent etching every move into permanence, the irony is excruciating. Nothing about this release was set in stone. Everything was set in sand. And Rick Ross's response to the numbers? Defiance. Rick Ross pointed to 20 years of sales. Rick Ross claimed to be already paid before the album comes out. Rick Ross framed the album as artistic work rather than commercial product. On one level, that posture is understandable. No artists want to publicly accept a flop. But the audience read defiance without results as delusion. When the streaming numbers are low, the tour seats are empty, the features did not help, and the only headlines are about rivalries and controversies, confidence without evidence becomes a liability, not a brand. The gap between the rhetoric and the receipts is where credibility goes to die. Then there was a Fat Joe podcast moment that perfectly captured the problem. During an appearance alongside Fat Joe and Jada, the conversation turned to washed-up rappers. Rick Ross jumped in to name 50 Cent specifically, while wearing a ring Rick Ross claimed was worth $1 million, and suggested Rick Ross could slap 50 Cent with a ring. Fat Joe immediately shut it down, telling Rick Ross that was not who Fat Joe was talking about, that Rick Ross was reaching, that Rick Ross was creating something that was not there. The moment was revealing. Even allies were pulling Rick Ross back. The obsession with 50 Cent had become so visible that peers were publicly correcting Rick Ross in real time. That moment carried weight beyond the podcast. When allies feel compelled to course-correct you, the message is clear. Even people in your corner see the problem. Fat Joe was not being disloyal. Fat Joe was being honest in a way Rick Ross's inner circle apparently was not. Step back and look at the full picture. Every decision Rick Ross made over the last 18 months connected to the same endpoint. Rick Ross severed the Drake partnership, losing the streaming engine that drove commercial relevance. Rick Ross escalated the 50 Cent feud, giving 50 Cent ammunition to amplify every failure in real time. Rick Ross picked fights in Canada, generating footage that undercut the invincible boss image. Rick Ross dismissed Drake's Iceman, inviting the commercial flight mockery that went viral. Rick Ross stacked the album with features, but without a hit single or a Drake-tier collaborator to anchor interest. Rick Ross announced a world tour, and seats went unsold, triggering discount pricing that signaled weakness. Rick Ross responded to every loss with louder confidence, widening the gap between rhetoric and reality. Rick Ross mentioned Daphne Joy on a podcast, handing 50 Cent a personal attack angle that 50 Cent had used before. Rick Ross wore $1 million ring while threatening to slap 50 Cent, and got publicly checked by Fat Joe for reaching. This is not bad luck. This is a blueprint, a self-sabotage blueprint, executed one decision at a time, each move compounding the damage of the last. Here is a question that the commentary missed. Was any of this intentional? Not the flop. Nobody intentionally flops. But the controversy strategy. Rick Ross personally said it best. Some people think picking fights creates energy and excitement for release. Rick Ross understood that controversy generates attention. What Rick Ross miscalculated was the quality of that attention. Attention without conversion is just noise. Millions of people watched the 50 Cent exchanges, the Canada clips, the commercial flight memes. Almost none of them streamed the album. The attention did not translate into consumption because the attention was directed at the drama, not the music. Rick Ross became the story. The album became an afterthought. The controversy consumed the product. 50 Cent understood this dynamic perfectly. 50 Cent even articulated it on record. It may be more attention than you used to get, but it'll be the kind of attention that when it goes away, you go away. Prophetic. Because once the drama cycle exhausts itself, once the memes die, once the Instagram posts stop trending, what remains? An album at number 4 to 5 on the Billboard 200. Empty tour seats. A feature list that could not compensate for the absence of a single undeniable hit. The controversy was a product. The music was the afterthought. And the market treated the music accordingly. And then 50 Cent delivered a line that summarized the entire situation. You had 20 features, and it didn't help. 6 words. Devastating. Because 50 Cent was not just mocking the sales. 50 Cent was exposing the strategy. Throw everything at the wall. Names, features, controversies, ring slap threats, business offers. And nothing stuck. 20 features. 20 guests. And still the album could not crack the conversation. That is not a sales problem. That is a relevance problem. And relevance problems do not get solved by adding more features. Relevance problems get solved by changing the approach. Here is where the analysis cuts deepest. Multiple commentators arrived at the same conclusion independently. Rick Ross needs a hit, not a feature, not a controversy. A hit, a song that exists on its own, that generates organic streaming momentum, that pulls listeners into the album rather than relying on the album to pull listeners toward individual songs. 4 years, Drake was that hit guy. Drake's presence on a Rick Ross track virtually guaranteed playlist placement, algorithmic favor, and crossover reach. Khaled served a similar function as a connector and hype engine. Jay-Z remains a potential catalyst, the kind of cosign that forces attention. But Rick Ross burned the Drake bridge, and no replacement has emerged. The album proved that 20 features cannot substitute for one undeniable, culture-shifting single. Features add color. A hit adds gravity. Set in Stone had color. Set in Stone had no gravity. And without gravity, nothing pulls a listener back for a second play. The brutal truth, Rick Ross can still write verses. The luxury imagery, the cinematic production, the larger-than-life persona, all present. But a verse is not a hit. A verse is a component. Without the gravitational pull of a song that demands replays, the components sit in a warehouse that nobody visits. The streaming numbers confirm this. The tour sales confirm this. The Billboard position confirms this. 17,000 copies. Number 4 to 5. For the biggest boss. The numbers do not lie. The numbers never lie. The numbers just wait for the narrative to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. So here's the verdict, and it is not a prediction. It is a diagnosis already confirmed by data. Rick Ross did not lose to 50 Cent. Rick Ross did not lose to Drake. Rick Ross lost to a pattern of self-inflicted decisions that dismantled commercial infrastructure, sustaining Rick Ross's career. The bridges were burned by choice. The feuds were escalated by choice. The controversies were courted by choice. And the numbers, the cold, indifferent, inarguable numbers, are the receipt for every one of those choices. Can Rick Ross recover? Absolutely. The talent has not evaporated. The voice still commands attention when properly channeled. But recovery requires something Rick Ross has resisted for 18 months. Silence. Not defeat. Strategic silence. Stop feeding 50 Cent ammunition. Stop dropping Drake's name for headline scraps. Stop generating controversies that produce memes but not streams. Find a hit guy. Build a single that stands on its own. Let the music do the talking that the interviews could not. The silence will feel uncomfortable, especially for someone who built a brand on constant verbal dominance. But that discomfort is the price of recalibration. The blueprint for self-sabotage has been fully executed. The question now is whether Rick Ross recognizes a blueprint, or whether Rick Ross keeps following it straight into irrelevance while 50 Cent watches from a television studio and Drake watches from first class, both of them needing nothing from Rick Ross, while Rick Ross still needs everything from an audience that is steadily walking away. Drop your thoughts below. Who handled this era worse? Rick Ross, 50 Cent, or Drake? Is the drama genuine, or has social media manufactured a crisis that the numbers would have revealed regardless? Comment, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We are now tracking this story in real time, and the next chapter is already being written.